This episode was suggested by several listeners, Raymond and Danielle on Facebook. It was also selected from several choices by many patrons of the MCP on Patreon. If you'd like to suggest a topic, you can do so on Facebook and Instagram at Morbid Curiosity Podcast, on Twitter at Morbid Podcast, and on our website, www.morbidcuriositypodcast.com. And if you'd like to help select future topics, you can go to bit.ly/morbidpatron, that's bit.ly/morbidpatron, to become a patron of the MCP on Patreon. This episode touches on the subjects of suicide and infanticide. If that's not something you want to hear about, this may be a good episode to skip. Humans are fascinated by gore and violence, but even more so, the mysterious and unsolved. Interest in these disturbing and unpleasant subjects is called morbid curiosity, and it has gripped hundreds of people throughout the ages. I am one of those people. My name is Hallie, and this is the Morbid Curiosity Podcast. This time of year always makes me crave a good ghost story. Halloween is my favorite holiday, so in celebration, we're going to talk about ghosts, and not just any ghosts, women in white or white ladies. I've been meaning to do this episode for a while, and I'm really excited that I'm finally getting to do it. Our annual short horror story reading will come out on Halloween. It's one of my all-time favorite horror stories, and I can't wait to share it with you. But for now, let's talk about women in white. As you may have guessed from their name, women in white or white ladies are female ghosts, spirits, or apparitions that are dressed in white. They are one of the most common types of ghosts reported by those who believe they have seen an apparition. By the way, as this is a history podcast, I'm not going to get into whether or not ghosts are real in this episode. My focus will be on the history of these sightings and the possible origins of their legends. Women in white legends are found all over the world, but are most prominent in the United States, Great Britain, Ireland, and parts of Europe. A common theme in their legends is loss of either a daughter, mother, or child, and a sense of innocence that is also lost. This is in opposition to red ladies, who are said to have been temptresses or seductresses in life, and gray ladies, who are usually said to have been older and more learned at their time of death. Another major theme in women in white legends is violence. Most of the stories involve abuse, murder, accidental death, or infanticide, killing one's own children, followed by suicide. At its most basic, it's a tale of a tragic loss of innocence, ending in an early death. The woman then becomes a phantom or ghost and haunts the place of their own personal tragedy. Other times, she warns others away from a similar fate, or relives her tragedy over and over. In some cases, women in white are associated with either water or a road, which speaks of a more ancient origin. Though her current form is that of a ghost of a deceased person, it's likely stories of women in white began as mythological female deities, or perhaps multiple deities that combined with other stories and possibly real events featuring specific women in white. This theory comes from the fact that eerie tales of supernatural women appear in many time periods and all over the world. These tales share several features. The obvious shared features are that these supernatural entities are female and dressed in white. Other similarities include a tendency to lure men away from safety and then do them harm, or to steal children if they wander outside at night. Many tales also include women appearing as omens of death, and the backstory of these spirits usually includes betrayal by a male figure. One of the most ancient tales with similarities to the woman in white legend is that of Lilith, a figure from Jewish mythology first mentioned between the 3rd and 5th century CE, but also linked to an earlier class of female demons from ancient Mesopotamia. Lilith is often described as a dangerous demon of the night who seduces men and steals babies in the darkness. Another possible ancient version of the woman in white is the Banshee. The first mention of the Banshee comes from around 1380 in Ireland, but it likely has more ancient pagan roots. While there are many different descriptions of the Banshee, most of the time she is dressed in white. Sometimes the Banshee is seen as a sweet singing virgin, while in other stories she appears at night as a shrouded woman, crouched over and crying bitterly, her cries mournful beyond all other sounds on earth. These cries are said to be an omen of death. Yuki-onna and Kuchisake-onna are two Japanese yokai, or spirits, which resemble the women in white. Yuki-onna is a snow spirit whose story was first recorded in the Muromachi period, between 1336 and 1573. Yuki-onna was often mistaken for a human woman standing out in the snow, either dressed in a white kimono or completely naked. She was said to lure young men to freeze to death in the snow. Before the 18th century, she was considered evil, but like many of the more recent versions of the woman in white, her story has become humanized by adding a backstory of betrayal. Kuchisake-onna was originally a human woman who had her mouth slashed and mutilated into a permanent gory smile by either her husband or a dentist to punish her for her beauty. Her legend has roots dating back to before Japan's Edo period, between the 17th to 19th centuries. She is said to linger on lonely street corners, wearing a mask or covering her face somehow. She asks passers-by if they think she's pretty, and if they say no, she kills them. If they say yes, she slashes their faces, giving them the same mutilated smile that she has. Both of these Japanese spirits are said to dress in white. In Europe, tales of female ghosts in white clothing appear as early as the 1300s. They tend to haunt castles, either as omens of death, wronged women who seek revenge, or the holders of a secret treasure that they will share with those who are brave enough to follow them. While more recently these women in white are interpreted as ghosts, the acts they perform harken back to earlier tales, such as the Morrigan of Irish folklore, who foretells death in battle, or Ran, a sea goddess of Old Norse mythology, who sought to catch careless men in her net and drown them. More recently, women in white have become spirits who appear alone at night along empty stretches of road. They inspire pity, and drivers often stop to give them a ride. There are many versions of what happens after this, but usually the driver is surprised when the woman in the car vanishes, and later the driver discovers that it was a ghost of a woman who died some time ago. This version of the story is prevalent in the United States, but appears all over the world, including Europe, Africa, the Philippines, and South America. Roadside ghosts or apparitions have origins in many ancient cultures, but are well documented in ancient Greek mythology. Crossroads especially were associated with the spirit world, as they were considered a place where the realm of the living and the realm of the dead touched, a liminal space that was neither here nor there. Crossroads were watched over by the goddess Hecate, and shrines to her were placed on the crossroads with the belief that it would protect travelers from the restless dead and other spirits. Crossroads are still used today as a narrative device in both music and television, where ghosts and demons appear on the road to make deals or terrorize the living. The variation where the traveler does not know the entity they've encountered is a ghost is quite modern. In the European medieval era, ghosts were easily recognizable and terrifying, and had a specific purpose to fulfill. They were supernatural, but sometimes demanded human things, like a Christian burial, or revealing a treasure they had buried during life to a family member in their time of need. At this time, the reason a ghost walked in the realm of the living was linked to their post-mortem treatment by their surviving family members, as well as proper religious ritual, such as being given a proper burial in consecrated ground. In the early 16th century, ghosts became more human-like, but were still very obviously spirits that terrified anyone who saw them. They were also not necessarily dead people. They could be wraiths or spirits of living people in distress or of living wicked people. However, spirits of the dead still demanded human things and retained a purpose for haunting. They most often came back into the living realm to protect or haunt their descendants or surviving family based on the actions of those people, rather than something having to do with their own burial or afterlife. Between the 17th and 19th century, ghosts gained greater variety. Their reason for returning from the dead was now focused on their own life before death, where the wicked became terrifying apparitions and the good might come back to aid the living. Many ghosts seemed to have less purpose, such as haunting an area merely because that was where they lived during life, or existing merely to cause chaos for the living, such as a poltergeist. Ghosts that still had purpose began to appear as ordinary humans with human motivations. They were no longer terrifying, but retained a creepy or eerie aura. The thrill of ghost stories became the human realizing that they had interacted with the dead, and not the actual ghost themselves. This is the type of tale that became prevalent in the 1870s, and the ghost would usually help or hinder the human, then vanish. It was also around this time that an unnatural death became something that made the spirits restless. This concept is so firmly set in our modern ghost lore that we barely think of ghosts occurring in any other way. This likely has a lot to do with the modern negative view of death in general, and what constitutes a good death versus a bad death. By the end of the 19th century, untimely violent deaths made the victims come back as ghosts and haunt the living, either seeking revenge or some other unfinished business, or because their death was so cruel and violent that they couldn't fully die, and went on reenacting their death as a way to come to terms with it or avoid passing on. As the Woman in White legend has existed throughout the evolution of ghost lore, there are many versions of the story, all with many possible origins. I'd like to focus on 3 well-known versions of the story: Der Weiße Frauen, La Llorona, and The Vanishing Hitchhiker. But first, let's pause for a word from our sponsors. Our regular sponsor is Audible.com. Audible can provide you with interesting and engaging audiobooks. In fact, there are over 180,000 of them to choose from, which you can listen to on your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or other MP3 players. MCP listeners can get a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial of Audible.com by going to www.audibletrial.com/MCP. You can also find this link on our Facebook page and website. If you sign up for the free trial, you get a free audiobook that is yours to keep, even if you cancel the service as soon as you finish downloading it. And the MCP gets the funding it needs to keep bringing morbid history to your ears. So go get your free audiobook on us. Lastly, if you like this podcast, why not sponsor the MCP yourself by becoming a patron on Patreon? Over 30,000 people download this podcast every month, but only around 60 people are supporting us on Patreon. For a mere $1 an episode, that's $2 a month, you can get ad-free episodes, bonus behind-the-scenes info, give your opinion by answering polls, get updates on previous episode topics, and see photos of my foster cats. For $3 an episode, you get monthly outtake reels. For $5, you get a monthly pub quiz, where I quiz my husband on past episodes. For $10, you get a detailed bibliography of all the sources I've used while researching each episode. And at $20 per episode, you get a bit of miscellaneous morbidity, a short essay on a random morbid topic every month. Previously, I've reviewed horror video games and famous morbid pieces of art. All of these rewards aside, your patronage supports the podcast and keeps new episodes coming. I can't keep doing this podcast without you, so go to bit.ly/morbidpatron, that's bit.ly/morbidpatron, to choose your rewards and support the MCP. You'll have my eternal gratitude. And now, back to the podcast. We could do an entire podcast on each of these 3 versions of the Woman in White. as each has a large body of scholarly work written by folklorists behind them, particularly The Vanishing Hitchhiker. But for this episode, I'll briefly summarize each and give examples of similar tales from the modern era. The White Ladies, or Weissefrauen of Germanic legend, are thought to originate in Old Norse mythology from the Ljósálfar, or bright elves, who lived in a part of heaven known as Alfheim and served the fertility god Freyr. As time passed, the myth changed, and the bright elves no longer lived in Alfheim, but on Earth. Jacob Grimm, of Grimm's fairy tales fame, theorized that the Weissefrauen might derive from ancient beliefs in ancestral spirits, or older native goddesses and nature spirits. The most famous tale of the Weissefrauen in Germany was well known by 1486, and had historical ties to people who really did exist. This legend takes place in Plassenburg, a fortress which was built in the 12th to 13th century above the town of Kulmbach in Bavaria, Germany, which despite a massive fire still stands today. The legend goes that Otto, Count of Orlamunda, died in 1340, leaving his wife, Countess Kunigunda, and their 2 children without much prospect. Countess Kunigunda was beautiful and wanted to remarry. Word traveled that Albrecht von Hohenzollern, also known as Albrecht the Fair, said he would marry her, but for the, quote, 4 eyes, end quote, that stood between them. Kunigunda took this to mean her children, so she devised a way to kill them and make it look as if they had died naturally. She used a strong but thin needle to pierce their skulls. Apparently she was discovered, and when word got out that she had murdered her children, Albrecht withdrew his affections, saying he had meant that his parents had disapproved of the union. Kunigunda felt intense remorse and went to Rome to seek the Pope and repent for her sins. He told her she must travel from her home at Plassenburg to the Berneck Valley on her hands and knees, a 12-kilometer or 7.5-mile journey, and found a convent as penance. Kunigunda did so and founded the Himmelkron monastery, where she became a nun and eventually an abbess. After she died, it's said she haunted the Hohenzollern family. She became an omen of death and was said to appear in several of their castles just before someone died. The first mention of this tale comes from 1486 and states that the ghost of the Countess was seen at many of the Hohenzollern castles. It was also stated that she was most often seen when the local nobles were ready for visiting nobles to leave, suggesting that the hauntings were staged. A specific count was especially targeted by the supposed ghost of Kunigunda. For years after, many women of the court would sometimes reenact the haunting for fun and wander the halls at night, all dressed in white. Countess Kunigunda was in fact a real person. The daughter of Ulrich I from the House of Landgrave, she married the Earl of Orlamunda, Otto IV, in 1321. However, the two never had any children before Otto died. He left Countess Kunigunda with a vast inheritance, which she used to purchase land from Albrecht von Hohenzollern. Their letters regarding the transaction are apparently cordial and do not hint at any sort of affair. In this location, she set up Himmelkron Convent in 1342 and entered the convent as a nun and soon became its first abbess. She died in her 70s around 1385. It's said she was buried in the cemetery at the convent next to 2 young children, which is where the legend partly springs from, but I couldn't confirm that this was true. This story of the White Lady of Plassenburg morphed into several other versions, where a ghostly woman in white went from being a death omen to haunting places where death occurred, such as execution sites and certain roads. Usually the tale behind the hauntings is similar to that of the legend of Countess Kunigunda. A young innocent woman has children by love or seduction and is then abandoned, or her partner dies. She either then goes mad or is so sorrowful that she kills the children, but instead of becoming nuns, these women killed themselves, and their ghosts appear at their graves, at the places they died, or where their children died. They appear as pale beauties dressed in white, and were omens of death or misfortune for those who saw them. These changes to the legend can be found in a New World version of the tale, which became widespread in Mexico. This particular woman in white is called La Llorona, and her legend has permeated Mexican folklore more thoroughly than any other woman in white legend. La Llorona is a female ghost dressed in white who wails at night in sorrow for her children. There are many versions of her legend, but all share the same narrative. A woman is betrayed by her husband or lover, usually when he leaves her for another woman, and subsequently kills her children in a fit of rage or madness. In most stories, she drowns them in a river, but in some, she stabs them. When she briefly comes out of her fury, she realizes the horrible crime she has committed and ends her life. Her spirit cannot rest, however, and searches the night for her children, crying out to them in the darkness. La Llorona is said to steal children who stay out too late at night, but also to lure young men to a death by drowning. This appears to be both a cautionary tale for children about the danger of staying out too late at night, and for young men to avoid strange women of the night. The first documentation of La Llorona, which means weeping woman in Spanish, comes from Mexico City in 1550. Her legend may be a combination of the Weissefrauen legend and local Mexican folklore and cosmology. The German version was closely associated with Roman Catholicism, and international travel by Roman Catholic clergy during the Middle Ages was common as they sought to set up monasteries and spread their faith all across Europe. During the Reformation, a time in Europe in which Protestant Christian belief began to emerge and violently revolt against Catholicism, many of the Catholic clergy moved into areas that were more prevalently Catholic to avoid persecution. One of these areas was Spain, and in the late 15th, early 16th century, these clergymen traveled to Mexico with the Spanish colonizers. Once in Mexico, the well-known tale of the woman in white took on aspects of local folklore and cosmology. The reigning theory is that the aspects of the Aztec goddesses Cihuacoatl and Coatlicue were absorbed into the story. Coatlicue, an earth and mother goddess, was described as dressing in white and was often depicted carrying a child or a cradle. Cihuacoatl was a mother and fertility goddess known to shriek and sob as an omen of death, and was also often depicted with a child in her arms. The rest of the legend associated with La Llorona is very European, as it shows the European societal value of monogamy. Ancient Aztec men usually had many wives, so the addition of another woman would not have had such an impact on an ancient Aztec woman as it would have on a European woman who was part of a monogamous society. Due to the popularity of the legend, it spread both to North and South America from Mexico. It's likely the older German version also traveled to the New World with other European colonizers and immigrants. This is likely how the woman in white legend became so prevalent in the United States. One woman in white legend, incredibly similar to that of La Llorona, is told about the White Lady of Spring Canyon, Utah. Spring Canyon was an area that used to be populated with coal mining towns in the late 1800s and early 1900s, most of which have been abandoned today. One of these was a town called Latuda, which lay 7 miles west of Helper, Utah, on Spring Canyon Road. Founded in 1917 around Liberty Mine, at one point the town was home to around 400 people. A ghostly woman in white has been reported to wander the area, either directly around the mines or near the mining office, crying and searching for her lost daughter. Other reports state that the woman lures unsuspecting young men into the mine to their deaths, or warns them away from the mine. This legend was so well known by the 1960s that teens used to gather near the Latuda mining office, hoping to catch a glimpse of her. One version of her story goes that her husband died in a mining accident, leaving her alone with her infant daughter. The daughter was then kidnapped and found dead in the river shortly afterwards. In her grief, the woman ended her own life, and now wanders the area searching for her daughter. The other version goes that after her husband was killed, the woman begged the mining office for the compensation she was promised in the event of her husband's death, but they refused to give it to her. She either drowned her child to save her from starvation and was institutionalized for madness, then killed herself, or was so angry at the mining office she got into a car accident, killing herself and her daughter. So far, no record of any of these events has been found associated with any of the mines in the area. But as mining is dangerous, and the families of the miners were always at risk of being ruined financially by the loss, it's possible similar situations did arise when mining was at its height in the area. Both the tales of the Weissefrauen and La Llorona feature a woman who is ruined and abandoned, murders her child and goes insane, then dies violently and returns as a malevolent spirit. Parts of both these tales appear in the third version of the Woman in White legend, which is the most commonly told in the US, but also appears all over the world. This is the legend of the vanishing hitchhiker. This legend is often told as true by someone who claims it happened to a friend of a friend. It usually goes something like this. Someone was driving alone or with another person along an empty road late at night. They spotted a young woman standing alone on the side of the road or at a bus stop, dressed in a white party dress. It was cold or raining, and the woman had no coat, so the driver pulled over and offered to give her a ride. She gave them an address, and the journey continued. At some point in the ride, the woman either demanded the car be stopped at a cemetery, where she exited the car and vanished, or she simply vanished before arriving at her destination. The driver was so confused that they went the next day to the cemetery or to the address and inquired after the woman, which is when the driver discovered that she was dead, and the woman they'd had in their car was a ghost. In all variations of this version of the legend, the ghostly woman appears at night or in bad weather such as rain, storms, or snow. The time and the bad weather are usually given as the reasons people stop to give her a lift. Most of these vanishing hitchhikers are either on their way to a dance or home from a dance, which accounts for their fancy white dress. The woman usually sits in the back seat so that the driver is surprised when she's suddenly missing. In some versions, she leaves something in the car or takes something of the driver's, like a coat. The driver is then compelled to visit the address or cemetery the next day to give or take back the item. If an address was given, the person living there, usually a family member, knows the story of the girl and reveals that she has been dead for years. If she vanished into a cemetery, the driver often finds their item on her tombstone. The backstory of the woman given by the legend usually states that she died in a car accident, was murdered, or ended her life at a young age. Sometimes the encounters occur at random, but other times they happen on the anniversary of the woman's death. Sometimes she died days ago, other times years ago. The modern tale of Resurrection Mary fits this narrative exactly. Resurrection Mary supposedly haunts Archer Avenue in Justice, Illinois, just southwest of Chicago. Mary wears a white party dress and appears in the dead of night. She has been seen all along Archer Avenue, and when people pick her up, she gives them an address in the Brighton Park neighborhood, but asks to be let out at Resurrection Catholic Cemetery on 79th Street. Once she gets out of the car, she either goes through the gates and vanishes, or vanishes just outside them. Sometimes she's spotted in the middle of the road, and people report thinking she was the victim of a hit and run, only to find her gone when they get out of the car to check on her. The legend goes that Mary died in a car crash at Wacker Drive and Lake Street on her way to a dance hall sometime in the 1930s. She has been said to haunt that area of road since the crash. Reports faded during the 1950s, but picked up again in the 1970s. It's been said there is no grave in the cemetery associated with Mary because she was buried in a rented plot, and after the 25 years her family paid for were up, her body was moved to an unmarked location in the cemetery. This event seems plausible, but the only way to confirm whether it truly happened is with a death record for a girl named Mary who died in a car crash in that spot before 1940, which has yet to be found. The vanishing hitchhiker ghost narrative was first noted in academic folklore studies in the 1940s. It's now the most frequently told, collected, and discussed piece of folklore in the world, thanks to its prevalence everywhere. The story is culturally and geographically variable, and the woman isn't always a ghost. Sometimes she's an alien, or an angel, or a vampire. In the US and Europe, in some cases, the woman prophesizes or warns against something, but usually she just takes the driver to the place where she either died or was buried. This legend was all over the United States by the 1920s, and its modern elements are quite obvious: vehicles that travel long distances, and no breach of medieval, Victorian, or Edwardian etiquette for a girl to be out so late alone, or for a lone male driver to pick her up. The story also spread rapidly from one location to another, crossing oceans and gaining local flavor quickly, which could not have occurred without modern transportation. Also, this ghost is a secular one. It does not fit into any religious theology. It also doesn't seem to have any purpose other than to repeat the event of her death over and over again. All that is emphasized is the woman's death and how cruel it was. So, where do all these legends come from? Are they all descended from one legend, or did they spring up when a real tragedy occurred, one that could happen anywhere in the world? Both these theories have been explored, and the true origins are no closer to being discovered. Some elements of all these stories are ancient, while others are very modern, so it's likely a combination of both theories, as well as the very human love of storytelling, that keeps these tales in circulation. Why a lone woman, and why is she dressed in white? Dr. Jeannie Banks Thomas, an associate professor of English at Utah State University, suggests that this type of female ghost legend twists the traditional Western/Victorian model of an ideal submissive woman, making both men and women fear outstepping societal norms. These legends also reflect gender stereotypes in which women are victims and men are aggressors. However, the woman, after death, becomes a villain. We are fascinated by villainous women, thanks to a societal stereotype that women are less violent than men. So when we hear a story featuring a murderous woman, we are fascinated. We're also fascinated by the idea of ghosts. Even the most educated and skeptical people believe or at least entertain the possibility of ghosts. This is usually because they too, like all humans, want to believe that there is something after death, and a ghost would be evidence of a kind of immortality. And it's for these reasons that women in white legends have spread across the world and continue to hold our curiosity. Do you have a woman in white story to tell? Or maybe another kind of ghost story? In honor of Halloween, let's have a day of sharing ghost stories on October 31st. If you have a woman in white ghost story to tell, or perhaps another kind of ghost story, post it to our Facebook page or email us via the MCP website, and perhaps we'll put out an episode where I read them out just after Halloween. The Morbid Curiosity podcast was produced by H. Lloyd. If you'd like to get in touch or suggest a morbid topic for me to talk about, you can tweet the show at Morbid Podcast or find us on Facebook and Instagram at Morbid Curiosity Podcast. If you like the show, please share us on social media. And please give us a rating on iTunes. Your shares and ratings help us reach new listeners and expand this wonderfully creepy community. Thank you to everyone who commented, suggested topics, shared MCP posts, liked or followed the MCP on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and gave us ratings on iTunes. People like Margie, Dean, Angelina, Heather, Christy, Aaron, Susan, Tori, Anna, Samantha, Flat Planet, Mariella, Bay Street Tattoo, Kelly, Simply Weird Lime, Raveler94, Kaylee Bob 315, Steen Aline, Meg SP, Madam Ivory, Janet Arid, Hezzy, Super Junior, and The Mountain Who Walks. SCL, Stina, Danny, Rosalia, Into the Portal podcast, Margie, Heather, Raven, and Sharon all have my eternal gratitude for becoming patrons on Patreon, as does Caitlin for upping her pledge. Thank you so much. Because of you, the listeners, our creepy community is growing, especially on Facebook, so head over there to engage with other listeners, discuss episodes and news articles, and share your own creepy stories and cute pet pictures. The MCP is part of a wider creepy community known as the Belfry Podcast Network. Check out the other shows on the Belfry Network at www.thebelfry.rip. As I said before, if you really like the MCP, please consider becoming a patron on Patreon. You can also give one-time donations by going to our website, www.morbidcuriositypodcast.com, and clicking the donate button. On our website, you can also find links to all our social media and sponsors, and other ways to contact us. If you'd rather contact us by mail, this address is also listed on the website. Another way to help the show is by going to our Amazon wish list at bit.ly/morbidwishlist. Any purchases from this list are greatly appreciated. We are eternally grateful for your support. My name is Hallie, and until next time, thanks for listening.